Well, welcome friends. My name is Unton Eller. I am helping produce this broadcast from Richmond, Indiana in the U.S. Glad to see so many of you online. Steve, I'm glad to see that you've joined me already. And so we're looking forward to Steve's presentation here soon. But a few moments as I have a few housekeeping items before we begin. Steve will be presenting our second in a series of three. The recording by Juliet Kilpin is available if you go to the registration page. Steve will be presenting today, and we're glad to welcome him here live from the UK. And then David Kerrigan will be joining us on December 11th, as you can see in the flyer above. For those with the Church of the Brethren or others who might want continuing education units, I'll be making a link for that available after the presentation, so stay with us. And so without further ado, I'd actually like to turn it over to Stan Dewick, who is the host of this webinar series, for Stan to introduce Stephen today. So Stan, join us online.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a delight to welcome Steve Finamore to today's webinar, and just like to introduce him to us. It was Dr. Stephen Finamore, in addition to his education and training in law and his work as a solicitor. Steve has worked in community development in both Inner London and through Tier Fund, the Peruvian Andes. He has studied theology and prepared for ministry at Regent's Park College in Oxford, and then completed a doctoral in New Testament. After a 10-year pastorate, Steve became the principal of the Bristol Baptist College, and that began that position in 2006. Steve has served on Tier Fund committees from the late 1980s through the first decade of 2000, and during that period he has also chaired the Latin American Committee and has acted as a trustee. Steve has been a trustee of the Baptist Union of Great Britain since the trustee board was formed, and his publications include God, Order, and Chaos, and Violence, the Bible, and the End of the World. In addition, Steve is the editor of the collections On Earth as It Is in Heaven, A Theology of Social Action and Wisdom, Science, and the Scripture. It's so good to have Steve Finamore with us today as he prepares and shares with us. And please join me in welcoming Steve in our midst today. Welcome, Steve.
Stan, thank you very much indeed. That's very kind of you. I do appreciate your introduction, and I'm also very grateful to Enton for his patient and very thorough work on the technology. Thank you both. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all of you who are present, whether you're in the UK or in North America. I'm really appreciative of this opportunity to share some thoughts with you and to contribute to this series on pioneering. And we're going to be looking together during the course of this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are in the world. We'll be looking together at the Bible's summons to join Jesus outside the camp. We're going to think through together how a pioneering God summons into being a pioneering people. Last time, those of you who were with Juliet's seminar will know that we thought about the need for pioneers in our present context in the West. We're not simply talking about those who are going to initiate new causes, but those who have an imagination fired by the Holy Spirit, who are able to bring into being and dream into being the new things that are needed if the gospel is to truly live among the groups that we discussed and we referred to as the de-churched and the unchurched in the lands in which we're called to minister and to serve. So Juliet helped us to think through the characteristics of these pioneers and the extent to which the things they do and the characteristics they possess can be learned or acquired. But I want to suggest that the pioneering spirit is one which belongs to the whole people of God. It may be that we're not all called to be pioneers ourselves, but the church as a whole is called in every generation to have those among itself who do engage in working in fresh initiatives and working with new ideas, who are set free to experiment and to try new things. But I think that in our own generation, it's one of those times when that particular calling, which is always true, is especially so. So that's where I think we find ourselves. Now, towards the end of her presentation, Juliet offered us this picture by Magritte, and she shared the thought that the pioneer is one who can look at the present, just as the painter is looking at the egg, and see the future. And the painter here sees that bird in flight. Now, I think this picture does invite a considerable amount of reflection, but it also has invited over the years a fair bit of spoofing, as people have not mocked or ridiculed, but gently teased the idea that the author is getting across. Here are some of those. You don't always get a bird when you look at an egg, and even when you do, it may not be in flight. And of course, you could do this with things other than birds. And finally, you can look even further forward, and here we see the painter or somebody hanging the painting in an art gallery. I think that the thing about pioneers is that they needn't all be the same. These are creative and imaginative people, and so they are able to look at the same present circumstances and see within them the potential for different possibilities. One sees a bird in flight, and bluntly another one sees their dinner, and another thinks in terms of fruit, another in terms of drink. So our goal in this seminar is to look at some of the biblical and theological ideas which lie behind pioneering, and to offer a framework, a theological and biblical framework, for the practice of such a pioneering ministry. In particular, I'm interested in the way in which the Bible indicates that the path to the future is paradoxical. It offers us both continuity with the past and yet also a radical discontinuity. I'm going to begin with a walk through some of the biblical material, and then we'll look at the issue through a kind of narrative Trinitarianism. And we'll do that via a look at some thoughts from social and cultural anthropology. And broadly, this is going to mean that we'll have 3 sections. And I intend to pause for comment for a while after each of those sections for you to comment or for you to ask questions of me or of one another. Now, I think it's really quite remarkable just how many of the Bible's great narratives tell the story of a person or of a community who moves away from the center, who deliberately, under the inspiration of God, self-marginalizes, someone who pioneers. And they do this in order to be obedient to God. They do this in order to do a new thing. So here are some Bible stories, and the first example I want to offer you is the instance of Abraham, the patriarch who receives God's promise of blessing for all humanity. Now, you know the story as well as I do. He leaves the land, the city of Ur, with his father Terah. They arrive together in Haran, And then at the start of Genesis chapter 12, Abraham is moved on again. God says to Abraham, go from your country, go from your kindred, go from your father's house, go to the land that I will show you. And so Abraham has to leave the center. He has to leave the urban contexts. He has to leave the safety of the known. He has to leave his family networks that give him a sense of belonging and identity and history and purpose. And he does all this at the summons of God. If he wants to do business with this God, if he wants to be shaped so that his story can shape others, then he must escape the context which once defined him and find a mode of life where he can be defined by God. Am I hearing that the video isn't working as well as it should, or am I okay to continue?
Steve, I think you're well. I'll see if I can work out with Carl to help him, but I think the rest of us have a great broadcast.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to suggest that it is leaving the culture that Abraham was a part of that matters. It's only if he leaves something behind that God can shape him so that he can be all that God wants him to be. And I think that there's a paradigmatic element to Abraham's story. He is the pattern for God's people. When the Apostle Paul reflects on Abraham's story, as he does in Romans 4, Paul presents Abraham as the pioneer of faith. This is the one who trusts in the future promised by God and abandons everything he has for the sake of that future. And then Hebrews also reminds us of the story of Abraham and tells us at chapter 11 and verse 8 that Abraham went out not knowing where he was going. And I find this very interesting because one picture of pioneering is to leave behind that which you know and embrace the unknown. And for many of those who are called to different forms of cross-cultural mission, whether that's to be called to another land, to another nation, or whether it's to groups that of a different culture within our own nation, it's still leaving behind what we know in order to embrace the unknown and indeed to be embraced by it. The next biblical story I want to suggest that hints at pioneering for me is the story of the Exodus. For some reason, the Israelites have to spend 40 years in the wilderness. They cannot go straight from Egypt to the land of promise. They have to spend time in a desert place before they can be forged or regarded as having been forged as a nation. They have to be a journeying people. They have to be constantly doing new things in new places. They have to learn how to rely utterly on the provision of God. If they don't do this, they cannot be formed to be the people of God. So this is not just a story of liberation, although of course it is that. It's also a story of transformation. And the Bible looks back on this period as a time of something foundational when Israel was forged as a nation. There are some conclusions that we could draw from this, but one of them might be that sometimes those called to do something new may need to be patient. There could be a long gap between the leaving of the old and the emergence of the new thing. But that doesn't mean that the time in transition is not necessary or worthwhile. It's just that the ultimate accomplishment takes a while for us to be able to deliver. The next story I want to remind you of is the story of Elijah, that cycle of stories we find in the books of Kings. There remain people who are loyal to the Lord inside Israel's institutions, but the hero of the story, Elijah, is very much an outsider. He's someone who spends time in the wilderness, who deliberately distances himself from the institutions of state. And Elijah becomes a kind of model for all the subsequent prophets. John the Baptist, for example, seems to offer us a deliberate echo, right down to his dress and the places where he ministers. A deliberate echo of Elijah. He is the archetypal prophet. He is the one who appears on the Mount of Transfiguration alongside the Lord. I'm trying to think of others who fulfill a similar kind of role. You remember, of course, the story of Amos, who seems to relish his role as the outspoken outsider. He's the outsider even to the point of denying that he is a prophet, at least not a prophet in the way that was understood by those he seeks to address, those associated with the cult in the north, those associated with the cult whose patron was the king of Israel. Amos is determined that he will be free of the taint of that so that he can say whatever God tells him to say into that situation. So the pioneer needs to grasp the idea that there will be times when he or she will be misunderstood, when he or she will have their motives and their loyalties questioned. But there's also the call for them to be involved as independent voices into politics. There may be the call to be a whistleblower where certain business practices are concerned, and so on. But the encouraging word from this story is that Elijah thought he was alone as a pioneer, but had far more support within the institutions than he actually realized. And that may turn out to be the case for pioneers too. It's just that the support is present, but not always able to make itself heard. The next idea, or the next story that I want us to think about, is the story of the exile. Sometimes seen as a kind of recapitulation of the Exodus story. Israel, having failed in the land, finds itself under the judgment of God, and this means being taken back into captivity, this time for the north into Assyria, and for the Judeans into Babylon. And so part of this is so that they can learn again what it means to be the people of God. Now, this is a most remarkable episode in Israel's history, because by any logic, this really ought to have been the end for Israel, the ultimate disaster. This is a people who lose their land, who lose their shrine, who lose their royal family, their dynasty, that loses its power. All the promises that they based their lives around seem to have come to an end. They are truly devastated. And yet, somehow, this time of devastation becomes perhaps the most theologically creative period in the entire history of Israel. It's the time when Israel's explicit monotheism comes to the surface and becomes an issue of reflection. It's the time when a theology of God's presence emerges that understands God's presence as independent of the temple and of the land. It's a remarkable period, and yet it only happens because of this devastation. And sometimes these people were pioneers, but they weren't pioneers by choice. And sometimes we have to face the fact that it's not an active decision on our part that makes us pioneers, but something which, in the purposes of God, comes to pass. In some of the Old Testament traditions, it is only those who've been through the exile, who have experienced this purging, who are understood to be the true people of God. They are the ones who are to bring something new to birth. They have been through this symbolic death, and they emerge the other side in their restoration to the land. In the end, this experience helps the people of God to be who they are supposed to be. So the work of those who go through this kind of agony is hard, but in the end it bears astonishing fruit. And then while we're with some reflections on the Old Testament, I'd like to say briefly a word about the prophets. There are many that we could talk about, and some of them are a bit like the artist in Magritte's painting. They look at the present and they see the future. They see their own context and they see its potential, and then they offer a critique of the present in the light of what might happen, what might yet be. So they see their own times in terms of what God might choose to do. Now, there are a huge number of texts that we might choose. There are the famous passages in Isaiah, which where the wolf and the lamb lie down together and a little child leads the entire menagerie. There are the wonderful visions in Ezekiel of a restored or a new temple. But the one I've gone for is from Zechariah, and this is Michelangelo's portrait of him that you can see from the Sistine Chapel. And my focus with Zechariah is on chapter 8 and verses 3 to 6, which is the prophet's vision of a renewed Jerusalem. When God dwells with his people, this is what there will be. And it's both like the present and unlike the present. There's continuity and discontinuity. He sees the streets of the city, or rather, I think probably the Hebrew points us towards an understanding of his seeing the market square, and he sees children, boys and girls, playing in those streets, and he sees men and women living to a good old age, sitting in the square, as it were, watching the children, and we're to imagine the hustle and bustle of city life. Everybody of all ages is fully a part of the city's life, each in ways appropriate to them. It's a wonderful picture of an appropriately inclusive community. And the prophet says, this might be altogether too marvellous for you to think it's possible, speaking to his audience, but it's not too marvellous for me, says the Lord God. And so it is that the prophet is one who is like a pioneer, one who offers a vision of what might be possible, and who rebukes those who allow their cynicism and their jadedness to say that something like this simply can't happen. The vision takes what seems to us to be the everyday and sees it through a different lens, a lens in which God is doing something new. I want to take us briefly out of the Old Testament and into the Gospels. There's a map just to guide us as we think about the ministry of Jesus. You know the Gospel narratives well. The reader of Matthew, to take one of the Gospels as an example, knows that Jesus is a royal figure, knows that he's out of the tribe of Judah, knows that, or if we read Luke, that he's closely related to a priestly family. And yet, despite all these connections to the centre, Jesus spends his time on the nation's periphery. You've got Judah in the south, which you can see on the map. To the north of Judah, you've got the region that they call Samaria, the land of the Samaritans, the land of the despised, those who weren't truly part of the people, those who were thought to have who had a different cult and who were thought to have brought pagan influences into their worship. And only when you go beyond Samaria do you get the land of Galilee. So you're beyond the Samaritans from the point of view of the place at the centre. And yet that's where Jesus engages in the most active parts of his ministry. That's where he begins. That's where he calls his disciples. That's the place where he engages in his exorcism and tells his parables and undertakes healings of vast numbers, where he carries out his nature miracles when he walks on the water and stills the storm. It's only later, as the Synoptic Gospels tell us the story, that he makes his way through Samaria and to the centre of power. But when he comes there, he comes with a different kind of ministry in mind. His time is spent in ministry on the periphery, and he comes to the centre to confront the powers manifested as Caiaphas and Herod and Pilate. The one from the margins belongs, the reader knows, in the place which each of these other figures occupies. For Jesus is the true priest and the true king and the one who is truly sent from the true Lord. So he is the one who ought to be in the place that Caiaphas and Herod and Pilate have usurped. And yet he works in the periphery. And there is something about pioneering which moves away from the centre and into the peripheries, which lets go of status and embraces all the possibilities that the marginalised places offer us. And in doing this, Jesus recapitulates the stories of the patriarchs and the story of Israel. He is a picture of the pioneer who is obedient to the summons of God. And of course, the story reaches its climax as the marginal one is marginalised yet further. He is taken outside the city to the city dump, and there he is exiled, not just from the city and from the nation, but from among the living. His last word, according to Mark 15:37, is an inarticulate cry, the victim being expelled, and at the same time God's verdict on humanity committed to violence. We'll return later to what happens next, but I want to take us on to Hebrews, for at the end of Hebrews, in the climax of the argument of the letter, the writer issues this summons: go to Jesus outside the camp. A reference, I think, to his crucifixion outside the city. According to the Old Testament, people were taken outside the camp to die. And death is the ultimate form of uncleanness. And we know from Numbers 5 and Deuteronomy 23 that the unclean were to be sent outside the camp. And here is Jesus outside the camp. And here is the writer of Hebrews telling the church, join him there, among the unclean, among those who are different from us. Note in Exodus 33, the tent of meeting, which later tradition places within the camp, was placed by Moses emphatically outside the camp. I find that quite an interesting thought. And if we pick up the model that Juliet shared last time, and we picture the camp as the church and perhaps the fringe of the church, the pioneer is summoned outside the camp to the de-churched and the unchurched. And in case you're thinking, but Jerusalem is not a camp, is it? You're quite right, it isn't. But bear in mind some thoughts that quite interesting ones from the Dead Sea Scrolls, just for a moment. In the Temple Scroll, there are some rules about cleanliness of the city that are based on the rules for the camp in the Old Testament. It says at one place, Jerusalem is the holy camp, the place that he chose from among all the tribes of Israel. Jerusalem is the foremost of all the camps. So that bit's not in the Temple Scroll, it's in one of the 4 Q scrolls. But in other words, some people within the Qumran community at least seem to have believed that the rules about the ritual cleanliness of the camp ought to be applied to urban centres, and particularly to Jerusalem. The urban is the place for the clean, the insiders, the powerful, but Jesus dies outside the camp, and we're summoned to join him there. And in the end, he is our model. Hebrews calls him the pioneer of our salvation, and 10 chapters later, the pioneer, that word again, and perfecter of our faith. He's also called the forerunner. So to be a pioneer is a Christ-like calling. So that's my overview of some of the biblical material. And I'd like to see whether any comments or questions about these ideas have been gathered, whether you can think of any other biblical examples from the Old Testament and from the Gospels. I'm going to talk about the apostles and the prophets a bit later, but there may be other Old Testament or Gospel images that you'd like to refer us to. So I'm going to pause there and see if we've got any comments coming back.
Steve, there's a very good conversation going on in the chat box, and Alexandra started it. I'm just going to refer back to her comment. She says she's interested in the idea of being constantly uncomfortable or unsettled, and how that is formative of us as a people of God. And then she makes the comment, and the outsider who might not even view themselves as a pioneer. Would you say more about that? Or could you comment?
Well, that's a very interesting idea. I'm going to go on to use some ideas from social and cultural anthropology to talk about the way in which places where we're uncomfortable, places where we're not at home, are formative and transformative. And so that's one of the things I'm hoping to explore in the next section. But I also think it's true that not all pioneers are actually aware that that's what they are. Some people who haven't been churched in the way that lots of us are, when they come to faith, simply spontaneously do things in a different way. And sometimes that's questioned by the church, and sometimes that's embraced. And I think that those to whom the experience of the Holy Spirit and of restoration in Christ is a new thing, sometimes people who can actually teach us a lot, and we don't listen enough to them because we're already too tied to our own old ways of doing things. So I think, perhaps Alexandra is onto something there, and it deserves further reflection.
Yeah. In what ways is it important for established communities of faith to identify and call out pioneers for its own health and vitality?
Well, I think that's one of the things I'm trying to drive at. It's not that everybody has to be a pioneer. There is a place for the established and the institutional church. But it is not enough that in every generation we just continue with business as usual. It's so important that we try, as those with pastoral and oversight responsibilities in the churches, to identify those among us with prophetic gifts and with pioneering gifts, and allow them and support them as they embark upon new things, and that we have the patience with them to recognize that their new initiatives may take time, that we shouldn't demand the sorts of results that we're used to immediately from them, or we should allow them to experiment, because even in those things which don't finally work in our terms, there is learning for the whole church. So I really think it's actually tremendously important that that pioneers and those with prophetic ministries and those with fresh visions are identified and resourced, because in the end the church makes its journey through seeing what other models work. And if we don't give ourselves the chance to set up other models, we won't move, or we will not be in relationship with the new models that do set themselves up, and much better to be in, friendship and relationship with them, and so that the learning is easier.
Yeah. If I could pose one more comment or question here, and then we can get back to your presentation. Andy Duffy makes the comment, could one who is not accepted in his hometown be a working definition of prophet, to use Jesus' words, or does it need a purpose, or i.e. speaking for God?
Oh, I think there are plenty of people who aren't accepted in their hometowns, where the hometowns have good reason not to accept them. I don't think that's in and of itself a qualification, but I do think that it can be very hard for hometowns to accept that they've had a prophet or in their midst and failed to recognize it. So it can be that we face more opposition in our home churches than we face anywhere else, or in our hometowns. And that's sometimes one of the painful things that pioneers have to deal with. It can be those we love most, those from whom we feel we deserve the most support, who are the ones who in the end are the hardest to win over. But as the prologue to the Gospel according to John says, if my memory serves, he came to his own, and his own received him not.
Yeah.
But to those who did receive him, he gave the power to become children of God. And this seems to me to be the pattern of the Scripture.
Well, I'm going to step out of sight, so Steve, and invite you to continue on in leading us.
Thank you so much. In this next stage, I'm going to experiment with some ideas that I've read about in my little bit of work that I've done in social and cultural anthropology. And this, as you can see, is a picture of the wilderness, taking us back to the story of Exodus. The wilderness is the land that is unmarked by human habitation. It's wild rather than cultivated. In other words, no human symbolic meanings have been placed on it. Only as the Israelites moved through the land, wherever they camped, that piece of the land had a particular cultural meaning placed on it through the way in which they arranged their tents, where they put the tabernacle, and so on. But beyond the camp, there's you move outside of the space to which humans have given, on which we've imposed a particular symbolic meaning. It is the wild. It is where the wild animals are. It is wilderness. It doesn't have the systems of meaning that humans give to the land that they cultivate or that they inhabit. But of course, that doesn't mean that it lacks cultural significance. It is actually extremely important it plays an important role in ritual. This is Van Gennep, and he is one of the thinkers that's helped me in my understanding of how cultural space works. Let me remind you of some of the things he said about rites of passage. These are the practices found all over the world through which humans within a particular culture transition from one way of being human to another. And among the most significant of the rites of passage are those which we associate with the move from being a child, or being viewed as a child in the community, to being viewed as an adult. Now, often in the UK, this is a transition which we see happening over a period of years. But in many other cultures, there's a ceremony which takes place, and before the ceremony, a person is regarded as a child, and afterwards they're regarded as an adult. And this thinker defines 3 stages in these rites. And the first stage that he mentions is separation. The second stage is liminality. And the third stage is what he calls incorporation. To give you an illustration, a child is separated from the ordered society of which they're a part. A boy, for example, is taken away from his mother, separated from the way of life to which he's been accustomed, and the men of the community take him away into the wild, to a place unmarked by human culture. This is where he is able to, through a series of rites and rituals and time spent in the wilderness, he is able to shed his old identity and acquire a new one. And this process might involve some real suffering. It might involve circumcision or some other symbolic death. And this happens so that a new identity can be born. The final stage is that this new person, perhaps even given a new name, is incorporated back into settled life. They go back to the village, but now the boy lives away from his mother, and he lives in a way which that particular culture regards as fitting for someone who is now a man. And there are lots of rites all over the world and many of them seem to fit this basic pattern. And I find this second stage especially intriguing. It is what happens, as it were, outside the camp, the place where things can be remade. And this brings me to Victor Turner and his work on the ritual process, where he develops some of Van Gennep's ideas and argues that the liminal stage of these rites often involves an experience which he describes as communitas. And this is the quality of life experienced by those who are outside existing social structures, who are in the wilderness, where the hierarchies that prevail when people are formally in community, where those hierarchies break down and a sense of enduring brotherhood and or sisterhood emerges. The experience of being together, suffering together in the wilderness is memorable and it is foundational. There is a solidarity across divisions. But of course, within the ritual process, this is temporary. It lasts for the period of transition, and once reincorporation happens, community with its hierarchies and its structures is restored. Now, I want to suggest that we can map this ritual process back onto some of the stories that we considered. Abraham needs to be a wanderer, to be liminal. He has to make the journey into the unknown as he journeys to being Abraham. Israel needs to enter the wilderness if she is to be remade as the people of God, have to lose their identity as slaves and be prepared to live as a free and redeemed people. They need to leave one culture, be reformed, and embrace another. John the Baptist is found in the liminal places. He's out in the wilderness, and that's where he offers baptism, which represents a new beginning for Israel. Jesus goes into the wilderness places, and it's there that you find these astonishing stories of feedings where thousands eat together as brothers and sisters, and the leftovers are collected. It's also for him a place of testing and remaking. So, how does this work in the cultures that I'm a part of? Well, most cultures have their wild places, and these turn up in folk tales. And in my North European context, the wilderness is the deep forest. In our ancient folk tales, this is where the non-humans live. This is where you go to find witches and elves and dwarfs and all the other things you associate with chaos. In one story, this is where a parent goes to abandon his children. Because once you get into the deep forest, there are no markers. You have no means of orientation. You can wander around in circles for days on end, just as you can in the desert, and just as you can if you put out to sea and you don't know what you're doing. So there are no markers. We have no way of knowing where we are. And so these places become symbols of, I don't want to say anti-culture, but of places that aren't marked by culture and therefore places of transformation. So in our folk stories, the forest is often where children end up as they make the journey into adulthood, as they undergo the decisive rite of passage from one condition or one way of being. And of course, in lots of these folk tales, adulthood is signified by marriageability. Most obvious example is the story of Snow White. This is a young girl who threatens the adult world with its hierarchies and its status because she threatens to usurp the place of her stepmother. She somehow escapes into the forest where she sojourns with 7, count them, dwarfs, encounters a witch, but she emerges from the forest to marry her prince. It's the place of transformation, where we move from one state of being to another. She moves from one ordered state through the wilderness to a new state of being. She has to go through that liminal period to experience, and there she experiences a different kind of social life, but then re-emerges to be reorientated or reintegrated into the society that she left. So, how does this fit with pioneering? Sometimes the experience of communitas is created in other ways. Elsewhere, Victor Turner writes about the relationships of those who go on pilgrimage together as an illustration of communitas, because the fact that people are making a journey together means that the traditional barriers and hierarchies break down and they experience a different kind of community life. People who go to university or to seminary together will often experience something like this, and then will go to reunions every year to try to recapture it. And even, university works quite well as a model for this, because you come out of it with a special form of dress. You go in as one person, you come out with a new status. You don't actually get a new name, but you might get letters after your name or before your name, which signify a new kind of identity. And pioneering is like this. It involves leaving one way of doing community, one way of being, and it's embarking on an adventure of remaking something where there is no map. That eventually a new sort of community emerges with its own culture, its own way of doing things. Some pioneers, having achieved this, then move on to something new. Others stick with the new thing that they brought into being and become part of it. But eventually the new thing institutionalizes. And at some point it will then go on to generate new pioneers and new possibilities for those who will do the next thing. Because sometimes there's a temptation to try to prolong communitas, this experience of life without hierarchy, of solidarity, of brother and sisterhood. But if Turner is right, and I don't know, but if he is, then the truth is that human life doesn't work quite that way. It is the flow between community and communitas, from the established into the liminal and back again, that does the work, that brings the transformation, that renews. It is that which makes things interesting. And this is the journey that pioneers make, from one ordered community through the liminal period, through the process of communitas, until something new with a definable culture is established. And then the serial pioneer then goes on and starts all over again. So those are some thoughts. At that point, I'll pause again and see if I've encouraged any other thoughts or comments, or whether anybody can think of other present-day parallels to these kinds of rites of passage I've been thinking about. And am I on the right lines about the sorts of journeys that new communities make?
Steve, we have a great dialogue that's going on in the chat box, and about one of the comments made, and they've been feeding off of some of these, is that people standing at the edge as pioneers, perhaps standing at the edge of the traditional community and standing at the edge of the societal context. And so what does that mean for leaders? What does that mean for the church? And how do we engage that effectively?
Right. Okay, well, I think the edge is a very interesting place to be, but communities need to identify different sorts of leadership. I think, too often we talk about leadership as though it's always the same thing. There are some who are called to the oversight of established communities, and there are some leaders who stand on the edge of those and see new possibilities. And one of the great problems we have as humans is that leaders are often more inclined to compete than they are to cooperate. And I think what we need to learn as Christians is, as humans actually, is that it's possible to be a leader and not be threatened by the leadership of others. To be a leader and to liberate others who feel called to do new things. We don't have to control everything, but so much leadership becomes what we in the UK and probably in the States gets called control freakery, if you know what I mean. So how can the leaders of our institutional churches identify people on the edge and encourage them to step beyond the edge and to do something new beyond our peripheries?
Yeah.
I think that seems to me to be what we ought to be. Those are the people we should be identifying, and instead of discouraging them or saying to them, no, you've got to come closer to the centre if you want to be a leader, actually identifying theirs as a form of leadership which is going to go beyond the edge rather than move to the centre.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's addressed the question or not.
Well, it seems like it means that we, in a sense, we really have to be curious people, more just as curious about the edge and what is beyond than what we are currently in terms of being the church. And so that deals with friendship. Now, Ryan Brott made an interesting comment earlier. He said, "I think there is much in the story of the exile that the church needs to take a look at. I'm wondering if the church is exile trying to get back to Jerusalem, but doesn't want to live out the call that Jeremiah called the exiles to in Jeremiah 29:7.
I think that's a very insightful thought. In my own view is that the church in the West, certainly in Europe, I don't know about in the States, is entering a period which can be helpfully compared to one of exile, having been an institution at the very centre of the life of European nations, where our leaders were treated as civic leaders. We've now moved to a position where we're marginalised, where no one's taking any notice anymore. And many church leaders here in the UK and many people in our congregations are in mourning for what they've lost, rather than finding it in them to embrace the new possibilities that being marginal to actually offers us. And I think that seeing ourselves going through a process of exile and being reshaped and reformed to embrace that position for as long as we endure it is probably the more biblical response.
It would seem then that we have to do have to have a very concerted self-evaluation and reflection of who we are as the church, the language that we use, and how, in what ways we look to the future.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I think it's very hard for me to know the extent to which the experience in the UK, and I think probably in most of Western Europe, is replicated in other parts of the world. I spend quite a bit of time in Peru, and the situation is very different there. Mm-hmm. And so I think I need to be very careful about making generalizations about where the church is on a global scale. I just simply don't know enough about your situation and context, for example, to feel able to comment. I would guess that in some parts of the US, perhaps some parts of Canada, the church is still very central to civic life. I don't know enough to know whether that's going to change or not, whether mm-hmm. we're ahead of the curve or because we may be on entirely different journeys. But certainly in our position in Europe, it's like exile.
Yeah. And I think we would share some of that, and then in other communities it would be different, or at least we would perceive it to be different, even though it may shock us to really discover where we're at. Is there other comments that you would like to make in terms of how we bridge into these communities, or how this communitas, that remaking of new communities, begins to happen and take shape for us?
Well, we will have all experienced this at different points in our lives when we go away from home on a think of the revival meetings that used to be held regularly in the state, the camp meeting, mm-hmm. where people would cross over the river and spend time in camp meetings and revival meetings, and life would be different for a week or two. Things would be transformed. People felt their relationships with one another and with God were moving on to a different plane. And then people, slowly, the old structures get restored. But nevertheless, that period was vital to the way that, to people's walk with God and to their experience of one another. It happens in every culture. The question is, have we got leaders who can build those kinds of groups of people who experience that kind of thing around themselves, but accept that that's not necessarily something that can last forever, mm-hmm. but that if you do it for long enough, a new sort of community will emerge that has a new kind of culture. We get enough of those going, some of them will thrive and flourish and offer us new models of church for the future.
Yeah.
I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, we have an interesting conversation going on here about how people in many of our Christian communities have difficulty making friendships and connecting with people outside the Christian community, and in what ways does that happen? What does that begin to look like? How do we break through those barriers and those walls?
Well, I think those barriers are often of our own making.
Mm-hmm.
Our problem is that we've got a model of church where we have to sustain big buildings and extensive social programs, and so they absorb all the time and all the energy that our church members have, because we think that's how we have to do church. And so as our churches decline, the active members have to work harder and harder to sustain what we've always had. And so they have less and less time to engage with anybody beyond the life of the church. And so you get this unsatisfactory cycle where fewer and fewer people in the churches are working harder and harder to sustain the model of church that we've got. If we could find new models that don't work that way, we would free up people to spend more time with those who aren't Christians and recover their missional identity. If the model of church that we've got is often undermining our effectiveness as missionaries, it's not that the barriers need to be broken, the barriers are in us. It's us that need to change very often, I think.
Yeah. Well, as I'll let us continue on, and then we'll be able to bring back some more questions to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go on now to the part of the presentation which looks at the Trinity and a way of understanding God, and looks at that from a narrative perspective. Christians derive this definitive and distinctive doctrine, the threeness and the oneness of God, from the biblical narrative and from our experience of prayer and of discipleship. So I'm not arguing for the Trinity as something arrived at through philosophical exploration, but something that is essentially derived from the story of God as we're given it in the Scriptures, even if it does demand very careful language to articulate it. It's a story that begins before creation with God in perfect love and joy, deciding to share that love and joy and creating the world for no other purpose than that. In a sense, it's pointless creation from nothing for nothing. God doesn't need it. He doesn't need our love or our praise or our cooperation. The universe is to that extent unnecessary. And therefore, because it's unnecessary, it can be embraced as a gift, as something gratuitous, as grace, as something to be enjoyed. It doesn't belong to the chain of cause and effect. It's brought into being out of love and joy as a gift. We do something else with it, I fear. But God is not to be seen as an engineer then who has a point, but as an artist. The universe is art for art's sake. It has no end other than itself. It's not functional. It's made for love and for delight. But once made, because it is loved, when a key part of that creation exploits the gift of freedom, and so the whole breaks down, God sets about the task of restoring it. And the key events in this remaking of creation, to make it more truly a place of love and delight, come when God does some pioneering. As God sends God's self into the creation. In the incarnation, we see the Son, the Word, the Logos, sent into the world. God decenters God's self. God marginalizes God's self. In the interests of the created order, God sends God's self into the margins. So we already have the kind of pattern that we associate with pioneering, the leaving of the known for the sake of the unknown, the leaving of the loved and the cherished for the sake of those who've yet to discover that they are loved, the embracing of the new. So the reason the Bible is full of stories of pioneers, I want to suggest, is because their stories are shaped by the life and by the call of a pioneering God. And this pattern, I want to suggest to you, is something which actually embraces the church. The church is the community of the people of God who are caught up into this pattern of God's own life. We are sent as Jesus is sent. We are sent in the power of the Spirit, partners with the pioneering God, and our activity is patterned after God's. It is participation in God's own pioneering. The story of the first disciples bears this out. They're summoned, but they don't know where to. They only know they must follow. They must put their foot onto the first step, even though they can't see the entire staircase. So it is with the pioneer. And this is one of those places where I might want to critique Magritte for a moment. Sometimes a simple dissatisfaction with the present has to be enough. You may have no clear idea of the future. You may look at the egg and not be able to see a bird, but you know that its being an egg is not enough. You know that you're going to have to look at that egg and you're going to nurture it, but you don't know whether it's going to be an eagle or a turkey. Abraham sets out not knowing where he's going. We may begin a new work without a clear idea of the end. Lots of pioneering simply goes one step at a time. But it's still patterned after God's pioneering, even though God does know that his ultimate purposes are for the restoration of the world. Think of the story of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle writes to the Romans, tells them he wants to go there, and then that he wants to go on to Spain. This is the vision that he's given. He wants to go to Spain because he feels he's fulfilled the gospel all the way from Jerusalem right up to Albania and beyond. The entire eastern part of the northern Mediterranean. He says he's completed the gospel. He wants to go off to Spain because he knows that Christ hasn't been named there. He wants to be a pioneer. That's his vision. It doesn't work that way for him. He has to go to Jerusalem, and he leaves in chains, and he goes to Rome, and for all we know, that's where the story ends for him. But nevertheless, Jesus has sent the church to the ends of the earth. The beginning of Acts, as Jesus talks to his disciples before his ascension and tells them that they will be his witnesses. It was a text that Juliet used last time. And we go to the ends of the earth. Now, for Luke, Rome may be, where Paul ends up, may be a cipher for the ends of the earth. But really, it's also the centre of the world of the time. But the gospel, Paul is determined, will go beyond that into the farthest flung places of the West, while no doubt there were others taking the gospel east and south. We've always been a pioneering people because we are caught up as the people of God into the life of the pioneering God who sends God's self and then sends us into the world. And of course, having decentered God's self, the one who is announced at his birth to be king begins in decentered marginal places. He's in Bethlehem, not Jerusalem. He's in the downstairs room where the animals gather at night, not the palace. He's in Nazareth, not Caesarea. He's in Galilee, not Judah. He's in Jordan, not the Gihon. He's in Capernaum and not Zion. And it bears saying that this is not an exercise in tourism. It is engaged, it is personal, it is risky, it is deeply painful. When the part of God that God sends into the world returns to God in a moment known to the church as the Ascension, God sends God's self into the world again, this time to empower and to enable, and those who have pledged loyalty to the sent part of God, the one we call Jesus of Nazareth, the Spirit then enables to announce and to live out the reign of this one. They name him Lord. They engage in the proclamation of God's reign and Jesus' revelation of God's love. And they say that to call Jesus Lord, they call Jesus Lord. I think this is to define the goal of the cosmos. So the reason we have this Trinitarian understanding is because we discern it in the Bible and we see God as the one who sends God's self into the created order. And the reason the church is missional and pioneering is because it understands its own life in terms of the life of the missional God, the one who sends God's self into the world and now sends his church into the world. We are a part of God's own sentness. We participate in God's own life. And this involves us in sometimes things which are painful, because just as God's sentness took him into extreme and marginal and decentered and difficult and painful places, so our being caught up into that life may send us to the new and the marginal and the decentered. I don't want to finish before I pick up on the theme of resurrection. Because in one sense, this is the idea that holds all my thoughts together. Jesus goes from life to death to new life. And the new life is like the old, and it's not like the old. It's continuous with it, but it's not defined by it. The people of God, as a result of this resurrection, are reimagined. We are no longer physical Israel alone, but we're now a people drawn from every nation. We're continuous with the past, but we're not limited by it. No wonder the church is described as the body of Christ. We are, the people of God is a resurrection people. Now, this pattern of life, death, new life is the pattern of the exile. It's the pattern of ritual. This is the pattern of pioneering. Now, the risen and ascended Christ has given to his people wonderful gifts, and some of those gifts are those people who are called to be midwives to the new things that God wants to do. The apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the ones who go beyond the borders of the known, who go out among the unclean, and bring new things to birth there. As Juliet reminded us last time with the story of Peter and Cornelius and Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, these are people who often work without a roadmap, but they're building new kinds of communities. They are the midwives of the new things that the Holy Spirit is doing. The apostles are the ones who are present to ensure that the new things have an organic link back to Jesus, that they are authentically part of that story. The prophets look at the present and imagine the new things that might emerge from it. They are the ones who are called to provoke the rest. Now, in Britain, there are lots of ancient traditions, and one of them concerns the makings of what we call a Christmas pudding. In particular, there's a tradition about the day when the ingredients of the Christmas pudding have to be stirred, and the day is sometimes called Stir Up Sunday. And in the Book of Common Prayer, there is a collect or a short prayer for the day. I'm sorry, I'm a Baptist. Here I am referring to the Anglican prayer book. You'll have to forgive me, but it makes my point. A collect is a short prayer for the day, and this one may have been based on an older tradition, perhaps a Latin original. But in any event, I'm not sure whether the tradition of Stir Up Sunday is based on the prayer, or whether the prayer follows the tradition of such a day. But the collect for the Sunday before Advent, which lots of churches here in the UK and perhaps elsewhere in the world are going to use a week on Sunday, the final Sunday of the liturgical year, is Stir up, we beseech thee, O Lord, the wills of thy faithful people, that they, plenteously bringing forth the fruit of good works, may of thee be plenteously rewarded through Jesus Christ our Lord. The prayer recognizes our need to be stirred up. In what may have been the Latin original, the Latin word is closest to the English word excited. We need to be excited. We need to be provoked. The prayer is a reminder that it's so easy for the church to get stuck in comfortable ways and patterns. The prayer is not a reminder to go home and stir your pudding. It is designed to rouse us from our comfortable domesticity and to do new things. But then again, also, perhaps what some pioneers do is simply to take the traditional ingredients and stir them up and serve them in new ways, do something new with them. All sorts of things emerged in the era of the apostles and the Christian prophets, and all sorts of things continued to happen in the post-apostolic era. It endured for a few centuries, and then the demands of Christendom and of empire, the demand for business as usual and for spokespeople to deal with, swept away, I think, this radical pioneering movement. One of the great tragedies was that it confused unity, which I'm all in favour of, with uniformity, which I think is death to the church. We need to recover a sense of unity which does not require that we all be the same. So I'm going to pause there briefly, if I may, to see if there are any thoughts, and then I'm going to offer my own conclusions, but you may want to say something about what I've broadly called the theological or Trinitarian section of this presentation.
Steve, thank you. I think that we're having a discussion here about the struggle with models of church that center around ritual, and in some ways, and how that affects being a church with imagination, a church that can be missional, where we're able and capable of working without a roadmap and building new communities. One of the things that I think we often hear is that sense for unity, and we use the language of unity when we're really speaking about uniformity. How is it that that language needs to be reshaped, or the metaphors that we use to steer us back to that sense of pioneering, of what the early church had captured, in which perhaps we have lost and are actually desperately seeking?
Well, I think our great tragedy has been that when we send out missionaries, we send them out to recreate the mother church that sent them out. So too often we see the churches that we plant as our children, and we expect them to be exactly like us. We need a different model. We need to actually send people out with the idea that we want them to produce something that's unlike us, or rather something which is both continuous with us and discontinuous with us. Something which, yes, can be traced back to, where you can see the DNA of the marks of Jesus in it, so that it's truly apostolic, but also has a new shape. It doesn't matter if they don't have deacons. It doesn't matter if they're not organised in the same way that our churches are. And this is true of churches of every denomination. We just have to let go of the idea that we're recreating ourselves all the time, and allow different sorts of things to emerge in different cultures. In the end, the churches that have thrived are the churches which have adapted to particular cultures or subcultures. Let's learn that and encourage our pioneers to do different sorts of things than the churches that send them out have done or become.
There's a conversation on the board talking about how at times that the people at the center of our communities are not always as open and receptive to the new life as those that are the edge. And is that, but yet we keep looking to the center for leadership, and we keep looking to the center for everything else. What does this say to us then, if new life is at the edge, and what is it? How are we impacting that or not impacting that by the way in which we're always looking into the center?
Okay, well, I think it depends what you get from the centre. If you get a centre which gives permission and encourages experimentation and is forgiving of failure, or perceived failure, then that's great. You shouldn't have too much of a problem. Too often, the centre is controlling. It wants to it keeps the budgets under its own control. It wants to ensure that those who go out have certain sorts of qualifications and experiences. It too often sucks the life out of those who want to do something new by insisting that they're trained first to do the old. Surely we've got to get past that and train up a generation of leaders who want to, or pastors and overseers who want to set others free to do new things. And that's my dream, is to have people at the centre who encourage things to happen on the periphery, who aren't obsessed with keeping the centre going. Because if you think that way, then you will drag all the resources into the centre, and you'll get the same problem we were discussing before, of a church that enters decline, and even in decline swallows up all the resources.
There's a comment made here by Dave Close towards the end. It says, picking up the metaphor of maps and journeys, can we usefully say that ritual as a compass can help us find the way, and using ritual as a map will leave us stuck in one place?
Yeah, I know, we can certainly say that. What a good thought. I think like so many other things, ritual is a great servant and a lousy master. If we allow it to dominate us, then we will spend all our lives making sure the ritual happens. If we see it as something that can serve us, when we feel it's appropriate to use it, then I have no problem with it at all. But when it takes over and controls us, and we can only do things in that way, bluntly, I think it will suck all the life out of us.
I want to give you time, Steve, to conclude with your final thoughts, and then perhaps to give some more time for question and interaction as well.
Thank you very much. The conclusion is relatively brief. One of the great tragedies, I think, of some current pioneers is that they cannot do what they do, perhaps with good reason, but they cannot do what they do without condemning what they've left behind. They have to say, I want to do this new thing, and they criticize the institutional. And I want to see if we can find generations of pioneers who can be free to do what they need to do while maintaining good relationships with the institutional. And institutional churches that can look at what pioneers are doing and encourage them without saying pioneering or asking that or saying that's not church. We need to be a people who are defined by resurrection. And resurrection people, by definition, shouldn't be scared of new things. Indeed, we should be encouraging one another to step outside the camp, to go to the places where Moses pitched his tent of meeting, to the place where Jesus summons us, to the places outside of our current ways of doing things, where the future might just take shape. We have all these biblical models of pioneers. We have these insights into the way that cultural anthropology tells us that humans need pioneering. We have our Trinitarian theology, and holding all that together, we have this great idea of resurrection, which all point, in my mind, to the call for the church as a whole to be pioneering, to see itself as something sent by God into the world, and to go to the margins, to where Jesus is outside the camp. Why? Well, as Jesus went, for the sake of the joy set before us. It seems to me that, in conclusion, that's the way it has to be. This is not to say that the church can never be institutional. Some of us are called to work within what already is. But part of the role of what already is to set free those who might be engaged in what might be. And I long for a partnership between those, so that we're not opposing one another or criticizing one another, but are loving, supportive friends of one another, so that each can play their part in the overall mission of God. And it's with that thought that I want to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, for sharing with us this afternoon. Powerful presentation. The comments that you've made have stimulated a lot of discussion on the chat board. A great deal of it we could not even get to because of limitation of time, but I think all the activity just says something of how it has spurred a dialogue actually from both sides of the ocean, and that's always encouraging to see. I'm going to have Enton step in for a moment here and to share some closing information that is important for those. Always takes a minute, but hey, that's the way it goes. There we go.
Great. Hello, friends. I'm so glad that you all joined us, and Steve, it was just wonderful to be a part of this presentation. As we begin to wrap up, and we'll have time for a few questions at the very end, I would invite all of you to click to answer the questions on the two polls that we have. We like getting feedback from you all just to make sure we know how we're doing. So the first question is, how helpful was the presentation meeting Steve's content and learning? And the second question is, how well did you like this webinar format? And if you could just click which answer responds best to your thoughts and feelings, that will help us to know. Also, if you ever have additional thoughts about webinars you'd like to see, please feel free to type those into the chat window or let Stan and I know. Stan, you might want to share your email address there in case people want to be in contact with you. I'll let you type that into the chat window. And then for those of you that are seeking continuing education units for today's program, I'll just place the instructions right there beneath the polls. If you could click that link and fill out the form there within the next day following this presentation, that would be great. I'll post that as a live link over into the chat window, but I warn you, if you click it now, then you'll miss the last few comments and questions. Other than that, I turn it back to Steve, to you and Stan, if you had any final thoughts or final questions that you'd like to deal with.
Guys?
Steve, as you've had a moment to pause and to reflect, are there some final thoughts that you would like to add with your closing comments?
Well, only that I've written down a whole list of examples and illustrations of pioneering which I've seen in Latin America and Africa and in the UK. And because one of the questions I was anticipating was that people might be asking for specific things. I suppose a couple of them. I
invite you to share those now. Yeah.
There was one that I was enthralled by when I visited Bolivia. And I've forgotten the name of the community, but I've never forgotten what happened. I was with Tear Fund, and I was told the story of how a community needed a water tower, and the church in the community got in touch with the agency Tear Fund, who encouraged the community as a whole through the church to organise a coordinating committee, which organised the construction of the water tower. But once they'd got that sort of organisation going, they then thought of a whole host of other community activities that they wanted to engage in. So the spin-off from that was that they then were sufficiently confident in themselves to contact the local authority and were able to get the resources to which they were entitled but had never had. So by the time I visited, this water tower had spun into daycare programs with the elderly. I think that there were all sorts of community buildings and so on. Because Tear Fund, rather than just do the work for them, encouraged them to get the whole community involved in engaging with the project themselves, had set a ball rolling which did new things both for the church, which became central to what the community was doing, and for the community as a whole. So you start a virtuous cycle with the right kind of intervention. That was something I thought was an interesting way to pioneer a new partnership with a marginal community in Bolivia. So that's just one example. All of these are going to take too long to talk through, but it's those kinds of things that I want to see the church engaged with. A spirit of enterprise.
Yeah. Alexandra raises a question: do you have any post-Christendom culture examples? Maybe she could even elaborate a little more on what she means with her question. Or unless Stephen, if you have an example there. I think what, though, I hear from you is that fruitfulness of the community turns into that positive understanding, and also even seeing more ways in which God is at work within themselves and in the wider context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe
well,
we
think,
are too as one. Go ahead.
I was only going to say that David Kerrigan's come up with a reminder about the Cahalia Cafe in East London,
mm-hmm.
which is a very, it's an attempt to plant church in the East End of London through a cafe, which is a remarkable project. I wanted to mention something that I saw in Peru, where a shanty town, a pueblo joven, what we would call a shanty town, was growing up, called Viva Mi Peru. And one of the local churches nearby decided that rather than just allow this to happen without getting involved, they would become part of the process by which the new community was planted. And they acquired land there, not just for a church, but also for a community medical store and space where they might be able to develop a daycare centre. So suddenly, as this community emerged, and these things spring up overnight, the church was already there, not just with a place for prayer, although that's important, but also with places from which they could provide practical service into the community by having people who are prepared to be in a shanty town from the very beginning. And a shanty town from the beginning is not a pleasant place to be, because you're without essential services basically, but you're in at the beginning of a new community. So,
yeah.
And while we're back to the UK, I think of my friend Ali Bolton, who was the first person onto a new estate in Swindon, felt herself called to be in a position like Abraham's, one of simply there to bless, who visited everybody as they moved into the social housing and then into the owner-occupied housing, simply to make herself available to people, and without her ever explicitly talking about God to anybody, a community of prayer has gathered round her, and she's begun a church which is now in membership with the Baptist Union. It's just a remarkable story. Simply by being there at the beginning of something, you're able, and being there simply to bless, you become a presence around which community gathers. These are the kinds of things that, Christendom or no Christendom, we can do.
Yeah. Our call to be a blessing to the context in which we live. Well, Steve, thank you very much. This has been fantastic, and I think we see that on the way people have responded to the webinar. And to everyone that attended this afternoon or evening, depending on your location, thank you for coming out and logging in and joining in this chat and in this learning context. And we do invite you back for the third webinar in this series with David Kerrigan on pioneering in a global context. And that will be on Wednesday, December 11th. And the time will remain the same. It's just a different day. Another presenter, and I think we have truly been blessed by Juliet and today Stephen, and we're looking forward to the December 11th event with David. And so blessings to you all, and thank you, and Godspeed.